Yes, please.
How do you take into account that, I have two thoughts about religion. Aside from supernaturalism, one is that religion is big business. There are a lot of money invested in the current religions in the world right now. Secondly, is religion seems to be inherently misogynistic. It's a way for the old boys network to continue to perpetuate itself to the exclusion of females, because they're all run, the great religion, except for Wicca, are run by men. So how do you take that, or factor that into account, that it's worldly in the sense it's a business. A lot of money is owned by the Vatican, for example. There's a lot of money in Islam, Mormonism, Scientology, and so forth, and that men tend to want to stay in control.
Right. So we go back to the idea that religions are culturally adaptive belief systems that are going to naturally try to thoroughly integrate themselves to be at least compatible with, if not controlling of, all the other major important institutions in a society. In fact, a cultural anthropologist will tell you that actually we can get away with it nowadays. But if you're looking at older or indigenous religions without a lot of this ideological superstructure, you can't tell where the culture stops and the religion starts. They're two sides of the same coin, right? Because they're so thoroughly integrated, and for the reasons that I think we were able to talk about. So what that means is that if you already have a culture that has selected a particular adaptationary path towards giving men exaggerated quantities of political power, you will tend to see the religion, and especially the theological superstructure, endorsing and even accelerating that. You would tend to expect to get a runaway effect, because who ends up being the priests? Men, right? So right? And so that's why I can quite rightly give the impression that you're dealing with a runaway steam locomotive of immense cultural inertia that's exceedingly hard to complain about, much less stop. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but, right? Your point was it's very hard.
Yeah.
These things are tightly linked. About the money, well, I think, right, we already have a clue why people would devote enormous amounts of resources into peculiarly theological superstructures under only some civilization conditions. Under what sort of peculiar civilization conditions would you expect to find large amounts of capital resources going into the theological superstructure? Because that actually, in the big scheme of things, is weird, demanding explanation. You don't see that universally across religions. You don't even see that necessarily universally across religions and civilizations in the last 4,000 years with theological superstructures, right? Zen Buddhism doesn't do it. Why? Well, I'll just throw out a couple of postulates. You folks may think of more, but one occurs to me. What if you have a clash of civilizations? In other words, you have two civilizations, each with its own religion and independent theological superstructures, engaged in a nasty war for long periods of time. Then, defense of your justification for your civilization, and especially the God that's leading you to victory, makes the priests really important. They become part of the bureaucracy. And so people are more highly motivated to keep a much larger propaganda, educational, and indoctrinational system in place during these sorts of cultural stresses. And we might add other sorts of stresses that could happen to a civilization. You might also find it if a civilization manages to engulf a smaller ethnic group. That ethnic group will either be destroyed, dispersed, or manage to survive despite terrible odds by intensely concentrating its theology to now become the culture. Judaism would be an example, among many, but that one springs to mind, where you find intense theological preservation, right? The Vatican, during certain particularly phases of crisis for the Catholic Church, with all of the warring European states competing for it and competing with it. Right. So, but these are just hints and suggestions. But there are large forces at work here, clearly. Great question. Here and then here. Yeah, go ahead.
You said earlier how maybe, the question of maybe if science would ever overlap religion. But I guess I just don't really believe that will happen, seeing as in religion you can nullify anything by just just explaining it in a different way. Like even in contradictions in the Bible or something, you could just say, oh well, he actually meant this, or he actually meant to contradict himself to explain this. So it just seems like it can never really be like replaced by science because it can just keep refreshing itself.
Right. So someone who thought that religious explanations could be thoroughly replaced by scientific explanations must already make two assumptions, neither of which might entirely be true or might be quite false, right? I hinted at this. One assumption would be that science and religion are trying to explain the same sorts of things in the same sort of way. False. I mean, that's a false assumption. Number two, it might be the case that science and religion are ultimately trying to explain the very large field and region of human experience. That's also false. Right? Religion is trying to deal with extraordinary, unusual events of dramatic cultural significance dealing with our relationship with the all. Science is not designed to do that. Right? Science can suggest and hint at ways of doing it, but once we go from a scientific understanding of nature in order to ask what should our relationship be with nature, we have entered either religion, theology, or philosophy. Which is good, right? Philosophers are willing to take on that job, but we have to understand that philosophy is started at that point. Right?
But they kind of like get at the same thing,
Sometimes they do. I mentioned earlier that theology might, and now here's another example of where you would find an exaggerated organ of theology, overgrown, like an organ of the body, stressed so it dominates the rest of the body. You might expect to find an overgrown theology when it is confronting intense intellectual competition, such as that when the church fathers, the bishops around the Mediterranean, suddenly had to deal with Platonic, Aristotelian, and Ptolemaic cosmologies. Some fought, most adapted, right? So the story is quite familiar. By medieval times, most of Christian theology had adopted or adapted what it took to be the best science and reason around it, right? And indeed, you find that pattern elsewhere. A theology will need some logical, rational, and factual tools, and if it doesn't invent them itself, it'll just borrow them, right?
Yeah.
Great. The person behind you had a question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask how you separate religion from other belief systems, and if you think that like a pure agnosticism is possible, because it seems like science, atheists, agnostics, like any person is going to have to give assent to some like presuppositions or unprovable axioms in order to have a belief system at all, and then like any thought that they're going to produce is going to come out of that belief system and be sort of assigned the value of like reasonableness, and then they're really just applying their belief system to another belief system. And I don't really know how that's overcome, or like what standard of reasonableness is being used